crystal beam.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Cursed Tapes. I am here, exhausted, but here. Tonight, doing something a little different. I could take my damn... Okay. It doesn't want to Oh, that's new. Oh, well, that's cool. Sorry, I just figured out something else I could do on my computer. Anyways, welcome to Cursed Tapes. I am your host, Jagger. Tonight is a new format for the show. We are going to be doing a live phone-in talk show, if that makes any sense whatsoever. Yeah. So basically, I have the link to the Discord in the description below, and you can join the Discord, join the caller waiting channel, and ask any of your questions that you may have about tonight's topic, which tonight's topic on Let's Talk is Resident Evil. We will be going over the game timeline, the movie timeline, what coincides with the movies, what is very different from the movies, and I will be answering any questions that anybody has. And anybody that wants to join the discussion, please feel free to join the caller waiting channel, and I will drag people in one by one and answer your questions just like a professional radio show. It's something new I'm trying out. I want to do more of these Let's Talk open forum discussions so I can talk to my viewers and talk to all of you, get your questions, answer them, include you all into the show, because after all, this is a community. And I want to foster a sense of community with my community. How many times did I just say community there? I have no idea. Anyways, before we get into the topics, or the topic, I should say, a few little bits of news that I found out this week. I mentioned last week that the Dead Space remake was a go. We have an official reveal trailer for that already, which is pretty cool. David Gordon Green, the man who gave us 2018's Halloween and this year's Halloween Kills, and potentially next year Halloween Ends, he is doing an Exorcist reboot in the same style, where it's a direct sequel from the second, or from the, it's a direct sequel from the original Exorcist by William Friedkin. And he's saying that he's not ignoring the events of the other films. This is just following the storyline to now. He doesn't acknowledge that those events exist in his timeline. He's just saying that his story picks up directly after the first film. I'm excited but nervous because The Exorcist is one of my favorite films of all time. It's my favorite horror film of all time. I trust him because he did such a good job with Halloween, but The Exorcist is a hard one to tackle, and I don't know if going from Halloween straight to the mother of all horror is a smart move on his part. Other than that, Jordan Peele announced his next movie. It's called Nope. It will star Daniel Kaluuya, Kiki Palmer, and Steven Yeun in theater 7/22/22. No details have been announced yet. All we have is the poster, which has a cloud on a balloon string over a town in the middle of nowhere. This is all we have. No details, no trailer, no nothing. So we'll see how that plays out. But those are the little bits of news that I found this week for you all. Also, I don't know if I mentioned it last week or not, but American Horror Story Season 10 has stopped shooting because of a COVID outbreak. I believe I mentioned it last week. It still has not resumed shooting. I believe that they are going to air the first half of the season and probably end up doing a split season where they'll do like a mid-season finale and then pick it back up when they finish filming the 10th season. We did get another poster, which leads us to believe that the main villains, quote unquote, behind this season is going to be aliens. We were led to believe that it was going to be sirens for the longest time because of the whole land/sea story that they were doing, but it's looking that it's going to be aliens. So I'm thinking it's probably going to be the controversies between UFOs and USOs, unidentified flying objects and unidentified submerged objects. So it'll be kind of interesting to see how Ryan Murphy tackles that and see if he's successful with it. But anyway, with that out of the way, let's get into Resident Evil. The Resident Evil timeline is something else. We have a movie timeline and we have a games timeline, and there's really no cohesiveness between the two. I wish there was. I wish the movies followed the games more closely, because they started out by doing so. The first Resident Evil film, follows Project Alice, and that was a creation of Paul W.S. Anderson, who wanted to include his wife, Mila Jovovich, into the film. So he created his own protagonist by creating Alice as a super soldier, essentially. She's like a T-virus super soldier. It's stupidly convoluted and nobody asked for it, but Resident Evil was released in 2002, and it was a mid-budget zombie film, which sees the T-virus released in what appears to be an office space, but it's actually the Hive, which is the underground center where the T-virus is being developed. That's where the most of the first film takes place, is inside the Hive. It's Alice and a team of mercenaries that she finds down there researching what happened, and she faces off against the Red Queen, which is an AI, and she tries to shut down all of Umbrella's systems. Her and one other person survive the film, Matt. They both get seized by Umbrella, Alice goes in for more experimentation, and Matt goes into the Nemesis program, which anybody that plays the games knows that Nemesis is one of the big bads from the series. He's one of the big bioweapons. So that got a lot of people excited, especially... Is there something different with your beard? No, there's nothing different with my beard. It's just clean, I think. Or it might be the shadow on my face. I'm not sure. Anyways, so moving on from the first film to the second film, Resident Evil Apocalypse. We're reintroduced to Alice. She now has super strength, and she's a super soldier now, because before she was just special-ish, I guess. But her body has bonded with the T-Virus, and she's now out in Raccoon City kicking ass. And Raccoon City is the main focal point for a lot of people with Resident Evil, because the main one that everybody remembers playing is Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil Nemesis, which both take place at the same time in Raccoon City. So what Paul Anderson decided to do was try to combine the two storylines. He introduces us in the movies to Jill Valentine, haphazardly, Ada Wong, the STARS agents, Nemesis, Carlos, in a very weird way. We get Carlos, but blech. So the movie storyline starts to veer off heavily right here. We get Nemesis. He's hunting down STARS agents, but he never... we never actually get Nemesis hunting Jill, because they never established Jill Valentine as a STARS agent in this film. But as the film progresses, it shows that Umbrella is trying to orchestrate this one-on-one fight between their big bioweapons, Nemesis versus Alice. And during this fight, Alice learns that it's her friend Matt who was experimented on. He was entered into the Nemesis project, and they found that he bonded with the T-Virus in a different way, and instead of staying human, he turned into Nemesis, who is this big hulking thing with one eye and a very, very, very big mouth. So that whole thing takes place. Umbrella decides to nuke Raccoon City, and blah, blah, blah. So between the events of Apocalypse and Extinction, humanity falls, and Umbrella tries to clone Alice, because Alice is the only one who has successfully bonded with the T-Virus. So they keep experimenting on Alice, trying to recreate her. And Extinction is basically just humanity trying to survive. They introduce us to Claire, whom we later learn is Claire Redfield, who was from Resident Evil 2. They should have gave us her earlier. And it's basically just Mad Max meets Resident Evil. And, oh, by the way, Alice has psychic powers now because they experiment on her more. This is also the movie that introduces us to Wesker, who is the main villain of the movie series. You keep coming back to Wesker every time. But by the end of Extinction, any of the remaining survivors are headed to a base in Alaska that's supposed to be a safe haven. Resident Evil, the Clone Saga. Yeah, this is basically the Clone Wars, because they've cloned Alice so many times that there's so many active clones of Alice that now the original Alice breaks into Umbrella and assembles an army of Alice clones, which brings us into Resident Evil Afterlife, which was awful. This is where the whole thing veers off course. They start trying to introduce game characters haphazardly. So we get Chris Redfield, we get Claire Redfield, we get Wesker, like superpowers Wesker. And they're still trying to play everything off of Alice and her clones. So they storm a bunch of different bases and try to take down Umbrella. Sorry, I'm trying to keep my thoughts in order here. I'm mixing up the game timeline with the movie timeline. That's how convoluted this shit is. By the end of Extinction, by the end of Afterlife, Alice now does not have her powers because she goes after Wesker, and Wesker injects her with something of some type of antivirus that neutralizes her psychic powers, neutralizes her super strength. So now she's just normal ass Alice with a bunch of experience. No more clones. They kill all the clones. Um, and yeah, so now it's back to Alice versus Wesker. Then you get into Resident Evil Retribution, which is basically a video game in a movie. Alice is locked up in a Umbrella facility, and she is forced to go through different simulations and testing because the Red Queen is now running Umbrella, so she's testing Alice for some reason that they never actually explain. But you get like a bunch of different types of video game levels, like Tokyo, New York, Raccoon City. It was really just a big gobbledygook of mess that they threw together, unfortunately. And then all of that leads up to Wesker offering to team up with Alice to take down the Red Queen. So she finally meets up with Wesker in DC at the White House. Wesker gives her powers back, and they assemble all of the main characters except for Claire. It's basically every main character from the games. Leon, there's a substitute Leon there. Carlos, Jill, who's now blonde for some reason, Wesker, Alice, all of them are there on top of the White House, ready to fight off the zombie hordes. And then the movie ends and they never show that fight happening. You get to Resident Evil, the final chapter, and you find out that Wesker betrayed the team, killed everybody except for Alice, who now doesn't have her powers anymore. But see, the final chapter kind of turned the whole thing back on its side. It got rid of all of the game characters that they tried to haphazardly introduce. It took the story and retconned the whole thing. And now the Red Queen is no longer evil. She's trying to help Alice because Wesker is actually evil. And he's trying to release a cure to kill all the zombies and be humanity's savior, blah, blah, blah. But what they don't realize is that because Alice is being kept alive by the T-virus, she'll die when the cure is released. But more convoluted shit happens in the movies. I don't want to spoil too much for everybody. But Alice brings the antidote to the surface world from the hive, releases it, saves the world, but ends up surviving, even though she thinks she's going to die. The Red Queen explains that she survives because the antidote only destroys infected tissue, leaving healthy tissue untouched. She simply told Alice that she would die because she needed to prove that Alice is pure enough to complete the mission, which she did. Blah, blah, hero's quest, whatever. The only consistent character through this entire movie franchise is William Birkin, played by Ian Shane, and he is phenomenal. He is such a great villain. His monologues are phenomenal. He's the only good actor in the entire movie series. And as Xander has stated in the chat, a movie focused on William Birkin's storyline would have been phenomenal. His journey from the first film, who he's only a side character, all the way to the last film is just something else entirely. So that's the convoluted mess that is the movie storyline. Now we get into the convolutedness of the game storyline. So Resident Evil's timeline is not based on releases whatsoever. It's based on their naming conventions, and it jumps around a lot. So we're going to go in timeline order, not release order. Starting off, you get Resident Evil 0. It was released in 2002, but in the timeline, it's July 1998. It was released 6 years after the original Resident Evil game. It tells the story of Rebecca Chambers and Billy Cohen, who they're battling through an aftermath of a train wreck that helped kick off Raccoon City's zombie issue. And we get a little bit of setup for Wesker and Birkin, who are actual game characters. But it all takes place... You're right, I did mean Ian Glenn. I don't know why I said Ian Shane. I'm a little off today. I'm sorry. But anyway, so Resident Evil 0 leads directly into the beginning of the first Resident Evil game, which was released in 1996 and takes place in July of 1998. It's fairly close to the beginning of the timeline. At this point, I'm kind of surprised that Capcom didn't release more stuff that leads up to the first game. But this one follows STARS officers as they investigate the Spencer Mansion in a mountain range. And this is your typical haunted house with zombies. Sorry, my nose is acting up funny. But Resident Evil 1 is like a haunted house game with zombies. Tank camera control, so you don't have any control over your actual camera movements. It's forced camera angles. It was meant to be scary. It kind of kickstarted the horror survival franchise. Your main focus, you're playing as Jill Valentine. Albert Wesker is on your team, supposedly, and your main enemy is the Tyrant. Not a whole lot of story in this one. It's just kind of setting the stage for everything. So then next in the timeline, and this is where things start to get kind of weird, is the first half of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. It was released in 1999 as it was the third game. In the timeline, it is September 1998. So we're still in 98. But the opening scenes for Resident Evil 3 occur about 24 hours before Resident Evil 2. There's a lot of obvious plotline ties to the second game, but it's more designed to show what happened to Jill after the original Resident Evil. It's sort of the first act of Resident Evil 3 sort of bridges the gap between the first and second game, but the next game in the timeline is actually Resident Evil 2, the full thing, released in 1998. It's on the timeline of September 1998. This is like the legendary game for the series. It elevated the whole franchise and set up so much narrative that would come into play later on in the series. We're introduced to the legendary Leon Kennedy, Claire Redfield, Sherry Birkin. This game takes place in Raccoon City, and we also get to know a little bit more about Umbrella, what type of viruses they have. We learn about the T virus. It sets up the universe a lot more. It doesn't do a great job doing it in the original game. You see a lot more story development in the remakes of 2 and 3. So you could conceivably play 3 and then play 2, or play 2 then play 3. It really doesn't matter. But directly after Resident Evil 2, we hop right into Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, the second half of the game. Again, released in 1999, and now it jumps to October of 98, which takes place 2 days after the events of Resident Evil 2. The most important things to remember about the second half of Resident Evil 3 is the destruction of Raccoon City and what happens to Jill Valentine. She goes on to play a pretty big role in the game series. She becomes kind of like the star player. She becomes everybody's like favorite character, so they kind of do a lot more with her. The original game had some extra ending sequences that did a little bit more about what happened to other characters like Ada Wong, Barry. But by and large, Resident Evil 3 was designed to be sort of a side story, and it kind of stays that way. It was never meant to be in the main timeline. It was more so just like, hey, y'all love Jill Valentine from the first game. Here she is. Here's what happened to her. Next in the actual timeline, we have Resident Evil Survivor, released in 2000. It takes place in November of 98. This was the light gun shooter. It kind of works its way into the timeline around the end of Resident Evil 3. Like right after the destruction of Raccoon City, which actually ties into what happens at the end of the second Resident Evil movie, the nuking of Raccoon City. Not a whole lot that we need to know from the game story-wise. It was literally just, hey, we need to make another game, let's do it. In that same year, we did get the other legendary title in the series, Resident Evil Code Veronica. This was a Dreamcast exclusive released in the year 2000. It takes place in December of 1998 in the Resident Evil timeline, but it pretty clearly and cleanly fits into the timeline. This is the game where we finally get to see Claire Redfield unite with her brother Chris. It also shows that what Chris was up to during the events of the first game, and it also establishes a professional dynamic between Chris, Claire, and Leon that would come into play later in future games. This is also the game that brings Albert Wesker back into play and confirmed that he's acquired superhuman abilities. So this is where you get Super Wesker that you see in like Marvel vs. Capcom, the depiction in the movie, etc. Moving on from that, we get the Resident Evil: The Dark Side Chronicles, released in 2009, and this jumps ahead to 2002. This was kind of a obscure title that was released on the Nintendo Wii. And you can easily leave it out of the timeline because not a lot happens. It's more so just bringing back Leon because everybody loves Leon Kennedy. It just shows that he's traveling the world and changing things, or and investigating more of the viruses that Umbrella is releasing and developing. This is a small plot type story, but it helps connect the events of Code Veronica to Resident Evil 4. And it kind of brings Leon back into the rest of the franchise. After the Dark Side Chronicles, we move into the Umbrella Chronicles, released in 2007, which was before Dark Side Chronicles. But it takes place after the Dark Side Chronicles in February of 2003. The Umbrella Chronicles is kind of more of like a recap game. It recaps like important events from previous games, and we get a little bit of plot progression in the last scenario of the game. But more notably, the game ends with Albert Wesker infiltrating a secret Umbrella facility and stealing classified files. From there, we learn that the evidence in these files is enough to convince the U.S. government to aggressively pursue legal recourse against Umbrella and its executives. So Wesker's trying to topple Umbrella, but also sees Umbrella at the same point. He's trying to create a power vacuum so that he can kind of seize control of Umbrella. Then we get into one of the best games in the series, Resident Evil 4. It was released in 2005. It takes place in 2004 on the timeline. This follows Leon. He has traveled to a village in Spain. He's trying to rescue the President of the United States' daughter. This is also the first time we ever see a different strain of virus. This isn't the T virus. This is a virus that was originated in Spain called Las Plagas. It's different. The only real reason it's important is that it ties Ada Wong to the rest of the series, and it ties her to Albert Wesker a little bit more. It shows them trying to acquire Las Plagas, and it explains why she's in Raccoon City for the second game. And you really just get more details on the fact that the virus, the T virus that we know from the original 3 games, wasn't always just the T virus. I told y'all this is convoluted. It's fucking weird. But after the events of 4, we kind of move into weird gray areas when we get to games like Resident Evil Revelations, Resident Evil 5, Revelations 2. At this point, they're just trying to reuse a lot of characters. There's no real tie to the actual story except for 5, and 5 is arguably one of the worst games in the series besides 6. So I'm going to read a synopsis for 5. So Resident Evil 5 sees BSAA member Chris Redfield pursue a bioterrorist named Ricardo Irving. A strange series of events results in Chris discovering the Tricell, the company that funds the BSAA, is not only advancing Umbrella's research, but has partnered with Albert Wesker in the hopes of utilizing its expertise on the viruses. We also learn that Wesker is actually an Umbrella creation who's trying to spread viruses as a means of wiping out humans not strong enough to survive. This is the game where we get the infamous boulder punching scene where Chris Redfield is fighting Albert Wesker in a volcano. And it's so bizarre. I honestly did not like Resident Evil 5 as a game. And there are many reasons why, the story being one of them. At this point, it feels like they're just trying to salvage the series any way they can. And the games that are holding them up at this point because this was released in 2009. It's the only way that they're trying to stay afloat, and the game series doesn't really come back into play until 2012 when they released Resident Evil Revelations, which takes place before Resident Evil 5. So after the events of 5, they kind of backtrack a little bit and try to explain why things have changed. So it's not... Resident Evil Revelations was never really part of the main Resident Evil series, but it shows why things are different, why Chris is where he is, why Jill is the way she is. But they never really expand on any of the events that happen in the game. It's strange, really, because then immediately after that we get into Resident Evil Revelations 2, where they attempt to connect the events from the different games. The biggest thing that the game really does accomplish is it brings a clean way to introduce Claire back into the franchise. And she's been out of the spotlight for quite some time. She hasn't really been in the game since Resident Evil 2. And she's kind of just been a background character. It's like, oh, by the way, Claire's here. By the way, she's here. Bye. And then she just fades off into the background. So we get that. And then we get other games like Umbrella Corps. It's such a bad game, like gameplay wise. The game itself is horrendous, but you have to mention it because of its place in the canon. It answers a lot of questions. Umbrella Corps essentially reveals that Umbrella was reformed over the years following the events of the original games, but they're focused on cleaning up the mess that the original Umbrella helped create. And they work with organizations like the BSAA to do that. This is also one of those games that implies Wesker survived the final fight of Resident Evil 5. And people still follow this theory to this day. People think that Wesker's still in the background pulling strings even after the most recent Resident Evil game came out. People think that he's still in the background controlling the BSAA and trying to reform Umbrella from the shadows. Then we unfortunately get into Resident Evil 6, which if you don't know anything about where the timeline is currently by the time you get to Resident Evil 6, and this is where the real life timeline and the release timeline match up. The game was released in 2012 and the game spans from 2012 to 2013. This is a big story and it's a lot to unwrap. So they bring back every major Resident Evil character except for Claire, who they just brought back in Revelations 2. But the game focuses on the C virus, and it shows how the organizations that are at work in Resident Evil 6 are trying to spread the virus, and how our main characters are trying to stop the virus. A lot happens, but the most important things that you learn from this game is that Chris Redfield stays with the BSAA in charge of a new squad. Jake Mueller, who is Albert Wesker's son, has become an operative, and Leon, Sherry Birkin, and Ada Wong are all still alive and functioning. But then, from here, we throw almost all of that out. Like 98.8% of that gets thrown away when they introduce Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, which is... It was questioning to a lot of fans because a lot of people don't understand where 7 plays into the rest of the series. But you don't understand where 7 plays into the series until you play Village. Because Resident Evil 7 introduces us to Ethan Winters, who is an interesting character. It also introduces us to a company called Blue Umbrella, which you don't find out until the end of the game, which the end of the game is what ties everything to the rest of the storyline, because Chris Redfield appears, and he looks a little different now, but he's flying in a Blue Umbrella helicopter, and there's a lot of references to the BSAA. we're thinking that because this takes place in 2017, that the game acknowledges that all the events in the past happened. The nuking of Raccoon City, Nemesis, Wesker, Chris Redfield and the volcano. All of that stuff we assume are recognized at this point. But then we get the long anticipated and highly hyped Resident Evil Village. And this takes place probably about a year, I would say a year or two after Biohazard. Ethan Winters, after rescuing his wife, moves to Europe somewhere. We're not entirely sure where, we just know it's overseas in Europe, per Chris Redfield's request. He requests that he goes out there, they do some training, they do research. He basically works with Chris now in a sort of like an advisory capacity. And from here, it starts to get way more convoluted. Introduce the Mother Miranda character, who is a form of the mold which you see in Resident Evil 7, which connects the two games together. We obviously knew they were connected because of bringing back Ethan and Mia Winters. But the game opens up with Chris Redfield kicking in the door, shooting Mia down, and taking Ethan's baby. And then all of a sudden you're in a caravan, and then you wake up in the snow, and you travel yourself to this village. And as you go on, you're kind of learning stuff about the village. You're learning the stories of the different house representatives, as we call them. We know of the big old vampire mama. She's Lady Dimitrescu. She runs House Dimitrescu. We also know of House Moreau, House Heisenberg, and House Beneviento. You have to progress through the 4 houses. You find out a little bit more about the story in each house. You learn that it's all connected to Mother Miranda, who is like a deity in this village. And she has killed your baby, split her body into these jars, which you have to collect and put into the Giant's Chalice, and then take the Giant's Chalice to the ritual site in order to resurrect your child and stop Mother Miranda. Stop me when this stops being convoluted. And from there, you have to fight Mother Miranda. You learn that Ethan has been dead since the beginning of the 7th game, but you also learn that what happened in Resident Evil Village connects those 2 games to the rest of the entire series. There are Easter eggs just before the final fight scenes, where if you read all of the notes in Miranda's laboratory, you realize that she's connected to William Birkin, Dr. Isaacs, all the people that created and started Umbrella. The village was the source of it. And that's why Village is such an important game in the series. So if you've seen or played any of the other games and you understand what's been going on, you realize that everything started at this village. Not at this time, like years prior. We're talking like 20, 30 years prior. But this is where the series kickstarts. And there's rumors that they're going to make another one. I don't know if they're going to make another game. I think they will. I know there's another movie coming out this year, which is called Welcome to Raccoon City, which is a hard reboot. I believe this nixes the idea of the first one, completely axes Alice character. We're going strictly video game characters and plot lines, and they're basically copying them from the game and pasting them onto the screen. So I'm excited to see how they're going to do that. They got all new cast, all new director. Paul Anderson has no hands on this whatsoever. Thank you, Lord. But that's basically the Resident Evil timeline in a nutshell. It would take probably about 3 hours to explain everything in detail. There are a few people on YouTube that do a very good job of researching every little bit that happened in the games. And it's been a while since I've played all the games. 7 and 8 are the most fresh in my mind, as well as the 2 and 3 remake. All very worthwhile games to play. A lot of fun. I'll probably end up doing a Let's Play of them here soon, just to kind of tie into the whole Resident Evil hype that's still going on, because we've just had Village released this year. It was highly anticipated. We have a new movie coming out. We have a new series on Netflix, Infinite Darkness, which is Resident Evil as well. It follows the animated version of Leon Kennedy. And honestly, if you want good visual Resident Evil content, watch the animated stuff. Like, hang on, let me see if I can find what the different titles are, because they have a lot. Oh, I'm not sending to my computer. They have a lot of different titles on Netflix that you can watch. Like, I think there's one called Resident Evil. It's not Extinction. But Infinite Darkness is the newest one. It's the series. And, the Resident Evil. So Netflix is actually producing a live action Resident Evil series, which I'm just now realizing, which is supposed to connect to the movie, but there are others that I can't find now. But Resident Evil Extinction, Resident Evil Afterlife, and Resident Evil Infinite Darkness are on Netflix right now. I believe Amazon Prime has the other ones. It has the first. I know it has the first two, and the last one. I just recently rewatched them all, unfortunately. But if anybody would like to join this conversation, ask questions, put your, like, say your input, say your piece on Resident Evil, I'm happy to hear it, because, man, I gotta tell you, the trying to keep everything straight from the games to the movies to the animated series, it's a lot. There's a lot going on. They try to include so much from the games into the actual movies, and Paul Anderson did a horrible job of it. He haphazardly threw everything in. He then retconned everything he said and did in the movies by completely nixing out all of the game characters except for Wesker, all to focus on his created character, Alice. Which I honestly think I don't think I'd be as upset if Alice was like the recurring character in all the Resident Evil games, which they could have potentially done. If they had made Alice your main character that you play through all the games and learn more about her and her her being experimented on by Umbrella, I would be interested in seeing that as a game, to be completely fair. Yeah, I could see it. I could 100% see that being a game. But with that being a Paul Anderson creation and now only in the movies, I don't see them capitalizing on that as a game title, which I'm not mad about, because seeing how convoluted the storyline already is, and knowing how convoluted it can be, or how more convoluted it would be if they had Alice as a character in the games, like, it hurts. It hurts my head. I was honestly hoping with the remix that came out recently that they would remake all the games to fit the narrative a little more in line with Biohazard and Village. So the rumors going around right now is that the next game is going to route everything backwards to the original events, because by the end of Village, we see Ethan's daughter Rosemary being trained how to use her abilities that she has, which is essentially like introducing an Alice character, but with whatever mold thing they've introduced in Biohazard and Village. Sker again as head of the BSAA, who's been pulling the strings for a lot of things for some time. So I could see them introducing Wesker, who's trying to get his hands on Rose because of her control over the mold, and that kickstarting as making Rosemary a villain, like a major villain in the next game. And then they could potentially, possibly bring back other characters if they're not too old by this point, because there's a big time skip at the end of Village, which leads me to believe that Chris Redfield is probably in his 50s by this point, which would make everybody else in about their late 40s or dead because of all the trauma they endured. One of the two. I don't know. We'll see. We did just get Village, so timetable suggests we'll get another Resident Evil game in like 2 years, maybe a year. I could see end of 2022, early 2023, possibly another game. But who knows? They may have already had something in development, and we'll get something like middle to early next year, which would be pretty cool. Be pretty excited about that, because you know me, I'll play it. But alrighty, if we don't have any callers in the chat, nope, we don't have anybody waiting. That's all I have on Resident Evil. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. Be sure to like and share the video. Subscribe to the Box Network on YouTube. Hit the bell to receive notifications when this show and all of our other shows go live. Be sure to tune in on Tuesday at 9 p.m. for Comic Relief, where me and Xander will be looking ahead at the upcoming season of Titans on HBO Max with our good friend Big Husky. I will be back for episode 7 of Curse Tapes next Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll be giving a mid-season update on the horror anthology American Horror Stories, streaming exclusively on Hulu. And episodes coming ahead. We're doing another Lex Talk in a couple weeks where we talk about Silent Hill. We'll be talking about the games a little bit. We'll be talking about the movies. Then after that, we'll have another update on American Horror Stories, which should be finished by that point. And then August 26th is when American Horror Story Double Feature Season 10 debuts. So we'll be talking about that when it drops. So again, thank you everybody for tuning in today. I love you all, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye.